Start out, we have a short agenda. Hopefully that's optimistic for this committee. Past repeats itself, but we have a short agenda, and I think Chair Colson, we also have the speaker coming in, and so when he comes in, we will either accelerate our conclusion or take a pause. I do want to welcome our three new members to our committee, Governor Lautenbach, Governor Huizenga, and Governor Levine on the telephone, and also Governor Lautenbach, welcome, and thank you for serving as chair. And so we will call the meeting to order. And you have in your package the minutes from our meeting on January 17th, and would like to ask if there are any corrections, additions, or deletions, and if not, I'd seek a motion to approve the minutes.
Move to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. Okay, before we get started with our agenda, I wanted to ask Tim to spend just a few minutes and get us up to speed on the latest, not the final, but the latest House and Senate budget information, budget proposals that, at least as of this morning, where they stand. So Tim, would you mind doing that?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. At everybody's desk, there should be two pieces of paper. It's what we call our executive summary, or side-by-sides of the latest budgets that were released by the House and Senate Education Appropriations Committees yesterday morning. And I do need... And Mr. Chair, I will say that the last 5 years that I've gotten up here to talk about the budget, it was always heading down. That was underneath Chair Perez's leadership. And since you've been leader, now our budget appears to be going up. So you're doing a great job.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Elvis.
But I just want to point out some of the highlights from the budget regarding the university system. And if you'll have your one sheet in front of you that has all the numbers on it. And for our new members, what you'll see is issues running down the left-hand side of the page, and then there'll be columns that will show what the board's budget request was, what the governor's recommendation, and then the Senate and House recommendations are. So the House released their recommendations yesterday, and just to highlight a couple of items, on row 25, you'll see before that, they did restore the $300 million, which is what everyone was a little bit concerned about. So $300 million back into the budget, back to each university as it was taken, with no strings attached. In addition to that, on row 25, they've added $65 million for what they're calling state university system performance-based incentives. We're not sure yet of any language or proviso on how those dollars would be distributed, but they are there for performance. On row 27, you'll see for 27, 28, for preeminent research universities, there's funding from both the House and the Senate for those institutions. The House also has on row 29 funding for the online university that the board spent a lot of time on over the last few months. And the next row, 30, is a recommendation for a 6% base tuition increase. And currently, the Senate does not have a recommendation on any tuition other than 0. If you go down to rows 36 and 37, it's related to the UCF and FIU medical school phase-in, which was in our budget request. They are fully funding that. And then if you flip over to the next page, or the back of that, you'll see various university initiatives that the House and Senate are funding. The Senate has a lot of red for some reductions for special initiatives. Those are primarily issues that were funded previous years. They had asked everybody to go through a base budget review exercise and had institutions submit a form to talk about the ROI and the success of some of those initiatives. In many cases, the Senate has zeroed that funding out. Last week there was a lot of stir, and I point you to rows 51 and 52 regarding Florida Polytech. You'll hear more about them at the full board meeting. Initially, they had zeroed out their budget except for about $5 million. They have added $5 million back into their base budget, which would give them about an $11 million operating budget for next year. The House has no recommendation for cuts for Florida Poly. Overall, you can see at the bottom line, it's about a 6% increase from the Senate and almost an 8% increase from the House. So very positive budgets for the university system. So there's a long ways to go, but we're off to a great start.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Don't go too far because I know you're going to be back up in just a second. And I'm going to comment just briefly on the current state of these numbers, but I did want to call your attention before we do that to page 217 in your package for the committee members. Since several of you are new, we have put in a schedule, a calendar of the primary activities that this committee deals with. This is certainly not all of the issues we deal with, but it is a good snapshot of the important dates. As I said, today's meeting is light, but that is not always the case. And our next, in our June meeting, is when tuition differential and fee proposals are taken up. And so at this moment in time, we don't know if there will be any requests for tuition differential or fee proposals. In the past there have been, and in the past those conversations have been spirited, to say the least. And this year there may be some again, there may be none, so we will see, but that is an important date. The fee proposals, if any, are due at the end of this month, and tuition differential are due after the session ends, so that the universities have a understanding of what the budget ended up having in it. So please just, refresh page 217 and keep your, let us know if you have questions about that. As far as performance funding is concerned, and partly to Tim's update on what is currently the status in the legislature in terms of the budget proposal, we don't know what will happen. We don't know how we will be funded. We don't know if performance funding will have, through this organization, a lot of money, some money, no money. But what we do know is that the move all throughout the country is for performance funding to be being taken more seriously and moving forward. And I think whether it's this session, which I certainly hope it is, and I think that's what we've all been working towards, or at some future time, we know that performance funding is going to be a key topic for us. And what we can't do is sit back and allow others, in my opinion, allow others to create metrics that really aren't appropriate in the eyes of the universities, along with the guidance of the Board of Governors. And so we're continuing to pursue our performance funding metrics as we, the collective group of universities and the Board of Governors, feels is appropriate. In our meeting, in our last meeting, we had, I think, a good discussion on the 10 metrics that were currently being discussed. And of course, the governor has proposed that there be performance-based funding in his budget, as Tim mentioned. So subsequent to our January meeting, Tim and staff members have worked even more closely with the universities on those metrics so that as we get into the June timeframe, we're ready. So I've asked Tim to give us an update on where we are.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since January, we have continued our work with the provost. We've had a couple of meetings. There was a meeting last night as well to continue to look at the metrics, further refine them, start working on the actual scoring of the metrics, the weighting of those metrics, and that process will continue. Also in January, the Chancellor created a cost per degree work group. As you'll recall, cost per degree was one of the governor's metrics. That work group has met on a couple occasions as well, has looked at different models for calculating cost per degree. They met again this past Monday, and I think they've kind of settled on a methodology We're continuing to refine that. We're hopeful to have that one finalized here in the next few weeks. So, Mr. Chair, we're continuing to move along, and hopefully we'll have something very soon on the cost per degree, and the provosts are continuing to work on the other metrics.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So what I'd like to do is first brief the committee on what I think the next step is, and then see if there's any questions about performance-based funding. We can't wait until June to finalize these metrics, in my opinion, because if all of a sudden we have to actually be distributing money based on metrics, we have to have really gotten closer to the finish line. And so what I'm proposing is that we ask staff to work with the universities to have these metrics finalized by June 1st, which I get is not that far away, but we're going to be having our June meeting shortly thereafter. And so I think we have to get to a point where we're finished. Now, what that would mean is, Chair Colson, and I know we haven't discussed this, but if we are asking for a June 1st date to have staff and the universities, in essence, agree on the metrics, that the Budget and Finance Committee would have to have an out-of-cycle telephone conference call to approve these metrics, and that we may, in fact, need to have the full board have a brief call if we need to approve these prior to the June meeting. And so we haven't discussed this, and it's...
We'll make it happen.
Okay. I don't think... I think with the way everybody's working so closely together, I don't feel like the metrics themselves are going to be that controversial. But I just want to get them finished before we get into our full meeting. And Chancellor, I don't know if that you would say it better than me, I'm sure.
No, I totally agree. And the university has been great to work with on this project. We don't want to make it sound like it's either easy or almost at the goal line, but your point is very valid, and that is the fact that everybody has been working collaboratively on this thing. Also wanted to point out that when you talk to all of the other states, and there are many who are engaged in performance funding, they give you lots of advice, but one of the pieces of advice which resonates across the board is if you have the opportunity to begin the process with some funding, to take a year, work through the process, and then go back and look at any refinements you feel you need to make before you go into it more deeply, take that opportunity. And I think what you're framing here today and our conversations about this with the legislature lead me to hope that we might be able to do exactly that, to make sure that before we sail down the river of performance funding in its entirety, that we've had the chance not only to build a model, but to test that model well before we can refine it and make sure we're ready to go. So you're right on target, I think, Mr. Chairman.
Are there questions from any of the board members or committee members or any of the university presidents? Because we're trying to make sure we're together in this road we're traveling down, and making sure that all of you feel that's appropriate to try to have a June 1st deadline to come to conclusion. Excellent. Good, thank you. The one other point I wanted to make, and it's just because I know we have new board members, and probably you all know this, but just wanted to make sure when we talk about tuition differential that we understand what we're talking about. And so just a quick history lesson, which several years ago the legislature, along with the work of Chair Colson, gave our board the authority to approve tuition differential, which is in essence the legislature sets the base tuition rates, and this board can consider requests for additional undergraduate tuition increases, where the combined total cannot exceed 15% over the previous year. And revenue from tuition differential must be spent on undergraduate students, with 30% earmarked for need-based financial aid and the remaining 70% to go to other undergraduate instruction. And so as we're throwing these terms out, it's just possible that they're just new terms to you, and wanted to make sure we were all up to speed on that. In our June meeting, we'll hear presentations from each university on their annual work plans, which will include any tuition differential increases, or maybe none at all, possibly. Those would have been approved by the local boards of trustees as well, and so that's where we are. So are there any questions on that? Okay, good. As far as actual agenda items we have to approve, item 5, auxiliary facilities, 2013 and 14 operating budget. This is our one action item on today's agenda, and that's the approval of the 2013-14 operating budgets. And Tim thought you could give a brief update on what that is, and then we can see if it's the committee's wishes to send that forward to the full board.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your packet, starting on page 227, is the agenda item and income and expenditure statements for various auxiliary facilities that have bonds. Section 1010.60 of Florida statutes authorizes the issuance of bonds to finance or refinance capital projects that are authorized by the legislature. These specific bond covenants, as set forth in the authorizing resolutions of certain bond issues, not all bond issues, but certain bond issues, require approval of estimated operating budgets for the upcoming fiscal year at least 90 days in advance of the fiscal year. So what you have here is the university's income and expenditure statements that show actual from 11-12, estimated from 12-13, since that's the year we're in now, and then an estimated budget for 13-14. Now, ultimately, you know, the university administration and the board of trustees are responsible for the day-to-day operations of those auxiliaries and making sure that sufficient revenues or expenditures are available to operate those auxiliaries. But this board is required to approve a budget in advance of the fiscal year for those. So staff has looked at the income and expenditure statements and did not notice any issues that we had of concern with, and we recommend the board approving the proposed budgets.
All right, thank you, Tim. Chancellor, anything you would add to that?
No, sir. Well said.
Okay, are there any questions on this item?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
this is Alan. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I had a question. I spoke to Tim about this last week. When you look at these income statements, you know, what I was looking at was the current year revenue versus the current year expenditures. And at the very bottom of each, you have the total cash revenue for that year available for carry forward. And there were two that stood out to me. What I saw was that they had decreasing cash reserves each year, largely due to the fact that they had expenditures and current year expenditures in excess of the current year revenue. And to me, that was just a flag that if they have declining revenue available for carry forward, what does that mean in terms of the bond covenants? Obviously, approving these doesn't mean that there's any problem with the bond covenants. I just had a concern that there was a declining carry forward. And I did get an explanation. There was two in particular. One was the FAMU Student Service Center income statement, and then the last one on the list was I think it was the FIU housing revenue bonds. Their cash available for carry forward went from 20 million down to 11, or it goes to 20 to 12 to 11. I've not gotten an explanation on that last one. I did get an explanation on the FAMU Student Services Center. Theirs was due to declining enrollment. They do have a plan in place to try to stabilize that, to get their cash balances back to growth again. I just don't know what this means, other than by having a declining cash carry forward and spending in excess of revenue each year, what impact that might have on the covenants going forward.
Tim, I'm going to let you see if you can answer that.
And by the way, I can't hear very well, if you might.
I do have, FIU is here and they can speak to their issue in just a moment. But one of the things that we don't have here is, say, a 5 or 10-year outlook to see where the trends may be for some of these. So yeah, there could be some maybe fluctuations in the numbers now, either due to enrollment or unexpected expenditure, or some reason there was a decrease in revenue. But not knowing, how that may flow into the future, we really don't know if there's a concern, but that would be obviously something the Board of Trustees would need to be keeping an eye on, on a much longer term projection than the one-year budget that we're approving.
And Tim, this is page 244 is the one in particular he's asking about?
Yes, and I'd turn to FIU to see if they wanted to respond to that.
Yes, sir, Mr. President.
Mr. Chair, I'll ask Amy Martinez, who's our Associate Vice President for Business and Finance, to answer that question. Relates to a new residence hall we're building.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Yes, that's exactly what the investment was. We are building a Parkview facility, so the cash being used for the down payment on the bond and for the construction is coming from that. So if you look at the line item where it says other operating and transfers out, shows $8.2 million. So that's really what's causing the reduction for this year. But those are planned. It was in the plans to do so.
Thank you. Governor Levine, you, I don't know if you could hear her, so could you hear the answer?
I couldn't. I'll get an update from staff later, but I just wanted to raise the point. Thank you,
Okay.
Chairman.
I mean, it's a good point to raise, and it's associated with ongoing capital deployment. And thank you for the question. Are there any other questions? Hearing none,
I move its passage.
thank you. There's a motion. Is there a second? Second. A motion is second. Any further discussion? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign.
Aye.
Motion carries. Okay, thank you very much. That we will have, Mr. Chair, we have two full board action agenda items, just approvals on previously read public notices that we'll go through in the full board. But that concludes our agenda. Are there any other comments any member would like to make? Hearing none, we are adjourned on schedule, even with the late start.
I apologize for the late start, but we were meeting with faculty at Florida A&M and it was important.
Yes, sir.
I apologize.
I understand.
Thank you very much.